As they were in the truck, Steve's eyes kept looking around. He and his family were relocating to a new area. Few days later, after settling down at their new place, Steve decided to take a stroll. As he was strolling, he saw an old house. On the house, it was written Temple of Fortune. Steve looked at it intently. He was tempted to enter and seek fortune for himself, because he was going through a tough time financially. That's why he and his family had to relocate to a cheaper house. But Steve was a Christian. He had to be careful so that he does not sin, and the house was locked and isolated with different graves. Then Steve had a second thought. He looked at it and laughed in his mind, and then he said, "How can they give you fortune here? The house itself looks like the opposite of fortune." And he continued strolling. On Monday morning, he went to work. At his office, Steve felt like a loser because his colleagues were doing well, but he wasn't. His colleagues were not struggling financially like him, but they all received the same amount of salary. Steve wasn't in debt, but his salary was barely enough for him. He kept wondering how his colleagues were able to stay financially stable. Even his boss kept complaining about his work and threatened to fire him. Everything was working against Steve. It was a sad point in Steve's life, but he wasn't sad. His trust was in Christ Jesus. Steve closed from work on Monday, and he entered a tricycle back home. He was alone in the tricycle. The driver took another road. It wasn't the usual road that Steve used to pass every day. Steve told the driver that this wasn't the way to his destination, but the driver assured him that he shouldn't worry, that he was going to take him to his destination. The journey continued. Steve was so tired, he couldn't wait to get home and rest. Suddenly, the driver was about to enter a compound. Steve was confused and was beginning to get angry. He asked the driver in a harsh tone, "What's wrong with you? This is not where I am going to." Then the driver said, "I am sorry, sir. Just give me a few minutes. I need to pick up something." And then the driver entered the building. The doors were wide open. Steve waited for 30 minutes and the driver wasn't out. He got angry, came down from the tricycle and headed towards the gate. When he got to the gate, it was locked. He couldn't get out. Then he went back to the building and he said, "Hello, who's here?" Steve increased his voice. "Hello, who's here? I need to go home." But no one answered him. Steve thought about jumping the fence, but he was a gentleman. The door into the building was wide open, and Steve looked inside the building, but he couldn't see anything. It was dark, and then he walked into the building. As soon as he walked into the building, the doors closed. Then he felt sorry for himself. It seemed like his problems were about to get worse. As the door shut, the lights came on. The first thing he saw were diamonds and gold on the floor. And then he saw a man carrying an egg on his head. The man was moving gently towards the door with the egg on his head, and the egg fell from the man's head and broke. And then the man received a notification on his phone, and the man began to weep. Steve was confused as he watched the man. Then Steve was told to join a line, but he told the woman that he wanted to leave the place. "Then please join the line." "That's your way out," she replied. "What do you mean?" Steve asked. "Please just come and open the gate for me," Steve said angrily. But the woman didn't reply to him. Steve tried to make a phone call, but his phone was off. He tried turning it on, but the phone refused. He charged his phone. He couldn't understand why his phone was off. At this point, Steve was both confused and scared. Steve angrily joined the line. He saw men and women, and they all looked tired. They were climbing a staircase. Steve had hope of leaving the place soon because they were not much on the line. As he climbed the stairs, he saw a pit at the side of the stairs. There were bones in the pit, and he saw a strange animal move. Steve became terrified and eager to leave the place. As Steve climbed the stairs, he saw people coming down from the other side with eggs on their head. As they were coming down, the eggs fell from their head and broke, and they all received notifications. They picked up their phones and looked at it, and some of them fell to the ground. Their sorrow was so obvious on their face. Some of them were in tears. One of them, he didn't look weak like the rest, said, "What is this? How come?" Steve was also confused. When Steve got to the top of the stairs, he saw the same woman that told him to join the line. The woman gave him an egg and said, "Put the egg on your head and walk to the door. When you get to the door, break the egg." Then Steve asked, "Why? I don't understand what's going on." "Do as you are told, that's your way out," the woman replied Steve. Then Steve put the egg on his head and he began to move. He had barely gotten halfway the stairs and the egg fell from his head and broke. Immediately, Steve received a notification. He picked up his phone and Steve saw a debit alert of 50,000 naira, and his phone switched off. As Steve watched, some of the people were taken into a room, and from that room a man was taken by force and thrown into the pit. All Steve could hear were loud cries. It felt like hell. Those that were left on the staircase were told to come and take another egg. When Steve got to the top of the staircase, the woman gave him another egg and told him, "Walk with this egg on your head to the door, and when you get to the door, break the egg. If you fail this time around, you will be left with one last chance to leave this place." Steve put the egg on his head and began walking. He had barely walked halfway the stairs, and the egg fell from his head and broke again. Then Steve received another debit alert of 50,000 naira. Steve was short of words. He couldn't believe what was going on. How did he get into this mess, he asked himself. A few hours ago, he was in a tricycle on his way home, and now the little money he has is being taken away from him. As he was thinking, he saw some people taken from the stairs and were put inside the room, and another man was taken from the room and was thrown into the pit. Steve heard a loud cry. Steve refused to cry. He walked to the top of the stairs and he asked the woman, "What's going on in this place? Why am I being debited? And why are you killing people? You came for fortune. Now you have to pay the price," the woman replied. "Steve, I didn't come here for any fortune. Just let me out," Steve replied. "Then why are you here?" the woman asked Steve. "I came here by accident. Let me out. I am not part of this." Then the woman said, "Take this egg and do as you are told. This is your last chance." But Steve refused. He insisted that the woman should open the door for him so he can leave. But the woman only stretched her hand further with the egg in it. Steve sat on the floor for hours. He was very tired. He was hoping that the woman would do what he said, but as he sat there, he saw people taken into the room, and people were taken from the room and were thrown into the pit. He heard the cries of the people as this strange animal devoured them. Steve was filled with pain and fear. He began to beg the woman to show him mercy, but the woman ignored him. Then the two people that had been forcefully carrying people into the room and throwing them into the pit approached Steve and said, "You are the only one left out here. Now you must choose to use your last chance or go inside the room." Then Steve stood up and took the egg from the hand of the woman. Steve put the egg on his head, and then he began to walk towards the door. He tried his best to get to the door, but the egg fell from his head and broke. Steve received another debit alert of 50,000 naira. All that was left in his bank account was 2,000 naira. Steve was filled with sorrow. He had lost all he had. The men took Steve and put him inside the room. When Steve got to the room, he met a man and a woman inside the room. The man was crying. "What have I done to myself?" the man asked rhetorically. Steve asked the man, "How did you get here? Why are you here?" "My greediness brought me here. I am a businessman. I had a successful business, but one day I met an old friend that used to be poor and lazy. He always begged me for money and never paid back, but when I met him, he had become rich. He lived a very luxurious lifestyle, a life I could only wish for. So I asked him what kind of business he was into. He said he deals on gold and diamonds. So I told him that I want to be part of it. He said okay, and then he brought me here. I have a wife and 2 little children. I don't want to die," the man said as he continued crying. Steve felt like he was having a nightmare with his eyes wide open. They sat there in the room for hours before the men came and picked the woman. She begged for her life, but they didn't listen. They dragged her out of the room and shut the door. Steve and the man heard a loud cry as the strange animal devoured the woman. Steve and the man were sweating. What a terrible way to die. Steve and the man stayed in the room for hours. They thought about escaping, but they were so tired. They had nothing to eat for days. The men came and picked the man. Steve heard a loud cry as the animal devoured the man. Then Steve began to pray. He remembered his faith in Christ Jesus, and that was his last and only option. Steve prayed with all his heart, and the door to the room that Steve was in opened. When Steve got out of the room, he didn't see anybody. The doors of the building were wide open. As Steve was going, he saw 3 Ghana Musco bags on the floor. He picked them up and began to fill them with gold and diamonds. He had conquered his enemies, now he had to plunder, Steve said to himself. All of a sudden, Steve was filled with so much strength that he could carry the 3 Ghana Musco bags that he had filled. He walked out of the house with the bag. The house was burning down. When Steve came out of the house, the fence and gate were gone. He walked out of the compound with the bags filled with gold and diamonds. There was a crowd in front of the house. Steve walked past the crowd, and it felt as if they were not seeing him. After Steve's ordeal, Steve developed various businesses. He bought a small football club in France and made it successful. Steve became famous due to his generosity. He later became the president of his country, but his riches were forever shrouded in mystery. Only him knew.